All right, we are back here with day two of our Machiavelli reading. We left off our discussion last time talking about Cesare Borgia and the way that he was able to utilize force and fraud, which are otherwise bad things, but he was able to utilize these things not only to consolidate his own power and to deal with the problems, the political problems he was faced with in the Romagna, as well as the elites that he faced. But he was able to use this power for the good of the denizens of Romagna. We remember that the Romagna was beset by violence of all kinds, and that Borgia used the Ramiro d'Orco to accomplish the ends of reestablishing order. And then once he had done so, uh, Borgia stepped in and prevented this authoritarian rule from becoming truly poisonous by inviting the villages and the towns to participate in the civil tribunal, at which Dorco was convicted. Borgia acted like he had nothing to do with it, and of course he ends with this final act, cutting Dorco in half and leaving his body in the public square so as to symbolize the end of the violence. And I do want to add too to that story. It's not just that the violence is ended, but notice the way that Dorco is finally dealt with. He's dealt with through the establishment of a civil tribunal. So for Machiavelli, there's a sense in which order comes first, right? So authority comes first, legitimacy comes first, submission comes first, and then once the need for force and fraud, once the immediate need for that ceases, you can move on to, a city or a region that's governed by law, and the civil tribunal represents then law, the achievement, as it were, of law. So if we think about life in everyday America, our life is governed by rules. In fact, we are governed by a remarkably complex matrix of rules. These rules are private rules, they're public rules, political rules. At the political level, these are rules related to the city, related to the state that we live in, related to the federal government. So we live in a very rule-bound order. But of course, this is an achievement, as it were. This is the icing on the cake. We're able to live in a rule-bound order because we don't deal with the threat of everyday violence. And you can imagine places where everyday violence is a reality. So if we think about sort of failed states, in the last 5 years, a place like Syria, previously, places like Somalia, uh, places where, they're places not unlike the Romagna, places that are beset by violence. And the idea of a court, right? The idea that we're going to have a traffic violation in a stateless society and that we're going to show up for our court date and we're going to have witnesses come in and like go through this whole rigmarole. I mean, it's ludicrous. Law is one of the last things Machiavelli thinks that can be achieved in a political order. And before law can be achieved, order has to be established. And so leaving the bloody sword there is he's sort of symbolizing saying, listen, the violence is done. This kind of lawlessness is done. And now we've reestablished law as the primary authority. And not only that, but the law is powerful enough. Its reach and its grasp are capacious enough that even former authorities, guys like Ramiro d'Orco, are subject to it. Okay, so today we're moving on. That discussion of Borgia, again, controversial isn't quite the way to put it, but I mean, this is a very subversive argument in the sense that, traditionally, the genre that Machiavelli is participating in, it's a genre of literature called the mirror for princes genre, and previous humanists like Erasmus had written little manuals, textbooks, guidebooks for princes like this. But these guidebooks, the mirror for princes genre, it was usually instructions on how a prince could become a better person, right? So the idea was if we're going to have these princes, if we're going to have these autocratic rulers, we want them to be good Christians in important ways. We want them to be benevolent, for example. We want them to be just. We want them to be charitable. We want them to be merciful. Maybe especially we want them to be merciful. And so Erasmus, for example, writes a brief treatise on the education of Christian prince. others in this same tradition do the same thing. And here Machiavelli is saying, actually, if you want a good prince, you don't want a Christian prince. What you want is a prince who knows how to use the principal tools of politics, which on occasion are violence and fraud, right? Violence and deception. You want a prince who knows how to use these things well. Now, of course, this leaves Machiavelli and it leaves Machiavellianism, right? Charges of being a Machiavellian. It leaves these open to an obvious retort, which is, well, how do you know someone is using violence to consolidate their own power and therefore to benefit themselves? Versus how do we know they're using violence on behalf of others, on behalf of the public interest? It's kind of a variation of the old "who watches the watchman, who guards the guardians" sort of arguments against authority. And we have a sort of response to that in the very next chapter. So in chapter 8, and this should have been about where you stopped yesterday. So if I'm going over material you read yesterday, that's fine. My comments today will run up through chapters 16 or 17, and then tomorrow we'll finish the book. He offers a kind of counterpoint to the Cesare Borgia story in chapter 8 with the story of Agathocles of Syracuse. So chapter 8 pertains to those who have become princes through wickedness. We see here on page 31 the story of Agathocles the Sicilian, who became king of Syracuse. Now, if this story has a kind of contemporary counterpart, it would be the story of a guy like Scarface. So if you've seen the film Scarface, when I was in uh, undergrad anyway, it was like every freshman dorm either had a Fight Club poster or a Scarface poster. I'm not sure if Scarface still has the kind of cultural cachet that he did 20 years ago. But the story of Scarface is it's a kind of a tragedy where you have this lowly Cuban immigrant who goes from essentially living in a Cuban an immigration internment camp outside of Miami and becomes this sort of drug kingpin. But of course, in the process, he sort of loses himself and he loses everything he loves, and he eventually loses his own life. And the kind of the point of Scarface is that there's an emptiness at the center of this kind of relentless pursuit for pleasure and for power. Actually, another interesting allegory to this is or another interesting parallel with this is a book that just had its 100th anniversary, I think just yesterday, 2 days ago, which is The Great Gatsby. So the characters of Daisy and what is Daisy's husband's name? I can't remember, but the two sort of rich characters, the married couple, who kind of break everything around them. And then, of course, the character of Gatsby, who builds this sort of empire. We find out only at the end that he's built this empire essentially on bootlegging and booze running. And of course, it all comes down around him. He doesn't get Daisy. He doesn't get he never gets to the green light or whatever across the water, and he ends up dead himself. I guess I should have had a spoiler alert there if you're planning on reading The Great Gatsby anytime soon. And we have a similar sort of story here. So he relates to us the story of Agathocles the Sicilian, who became the king of Syracuse, not only an ordinary citizen, but also of the lowest and most abject condition. A potter's son, this man lived a wicked life at every stage of his career. So again, this is a sort of a rags to riches story. Yet he joined to his wickedness such strength of mind and body that when he entered upon a military career, he rose through the ranks to become praetor of Syracuse. Once placed in such a position, having decided to become prince and to hold with violence and without any obligations to others what had been conferred upon him by universal consent, and having informed Hamilcar the Carthaginian, who was waging war with his armies in Sicily, one morning he called together the people in the Senate of Syracuse as if he were going to discuss some matters concerning the Republic. At a prearranged signal, he had his troops kill all the senators and the richest citizens, and when they were dead, he seized and held the rule of the city without any opposition from the citizenry. Although he was twice defeated by the Carthaginians and finally besieged, not only was he able to defend his city, but leaving part of his troops for the defense of the siege, and with other forces, he attacked Africa. And in a short time, he freed Syracuse from the siege and forced the Carthaginians into dire straits. This is the same Carthaginians, by the way. These are references to the city of Carthage, which would famously oppose itself to Rome a few centuries later. They were obliged to make peace with him and to be content with dominion over Africa, leaving Sicily to Agathocles. So this would seem to be a sort of Borgia-like story, right? So this is a guy who comes from nothing. Borgia, for example, came from a very wealthy family. He's a member of the Borgias. A lot of his power, as we saw in the last chapter, was handed to him in Machiavelli's phrase by fortune. So, in other words, by the position that he was in by birth. So, Agathocles seems to have a kind of edge on Borgia in this regard. He came from absolutely nothing. The kingdom of Sicily, which came to be his, he rose from essentially nothing and became the king of Sicily um, through sheer cunning, right? This wasn't an accident. It wasn't like anyone handed it to him. He didn't win the lottery. This is sheer hard work, determination, and cunning. And so normally our model of a Machiavellian is a sort of cunning figure who gets what they want through force and deception and who ultimately outsmarts everyone. This would seem to kind of fit that mold of the Machiavellian. Agathocles would seem to be a Borgia-like figure. In fact, he would seem to be Borgia, but even better. Um, but here's what Machiavelli says. Anyone, therefore, who examines the deeds and the life of this man will observe nothing or very little that can be attributed to fortune, right? None of this was handed to him. Not with the assistance of others, as was mentioned before, but by rising through the ranks, which involved 1,000 hardships and dangers, did he come to rule the principality that he then maintained by many brave and dangerous actions. Still, and this is the key part here, it cannot be called virtue to kill one's fellow citizens and to betray allies, to be without faith, without pity, without religion. By these means, one can acquire power, but not glory. So this is a great phrase here, power, but not glory. By the way, when you see these little asterisks, these little asterisks at the end of a sentence, um, those so these Oxford Classic editions, we're reading the Oxford Classic editions, they hire fancy editors, renowned scholars. I forget who did this one to kind of go through and tag these up like this. So these are basically references to the apparatus at the end of the book. And so if you read a passage that seems interesting and it has this little asterisk at the end, you can just flip up to the end and figure out what the editor wants to say about this. So here is page 31. Right, and here it is: acquire power but not glory. In this important statement, Machiavelli separates virtue from the completely immoral actions of Agathocles, declaring that such misdeeds can only earn dominio, but not glory. And then he explains the contrast with Borgia as well. And we'll talk about this concept of virtue tomorrow when we discuss virtue versus fortuna. So let's go back to our page. All right, so Agathocles, he says, acquired power, but not glory, whereas Borgia seems to have both. If one were to consider Agathocles' virtue in getting into and out of dangers, and his greatness of spirit in bearing up under and overcoming adversities, one can see no reason why he should be judged inferior to any most excellent commander, including a guy like Borgia. Nevertheless, his vicious cruelty and inhumanity, along with numerous wicked deeds, do not permit us to honor him among the most excellent of men. So what he did wrong, what Agathocles did wrong, was he went too far. For Agathocles, the violence and the power consolidations, these were ends in themselves. Right? He didn't get these things because he didn't pursue these things. He didn't acquire these things. He didn't acquire this political power because he sought to govern well. He didn't get these things because he sought to govern others and to provide stability and order to the people. In other words, he didn't want to acquire these tools for the actual purpose that they're meant. Instead, all he wanted to do was just have them. Likewise, with a million of these stories when it comes to riches and fame, a lot of people want to be rich and they want to be famous, but they don't want to be rich and famous for any other reason than to be rich and famous. And so, what Machiavelli is saying here is that, listen, we can acknowledge that they're rich and famous. We can acknowledge that Agathocles acquired a lot of power, political power, that he did it in an extraordinarily intelligent and cunning fashion, that he did it without ever having anything handed to him. But at the same time, we cannot call him by any means a good ruler. We can't call him a good man. We can't say that anyone besides himself benefited from these acts of cruelty and inhumanity. He and he alone was the sole beneficiary of these. So we can acknowledge on the one hand that he was a great and cunning, sorry, not great and cunning, but a very cunning incredibly a kind of ingenious sort of politician, but we can never mistake him for a figure like Borgia because his wickedness and his viciousness served no other ends outside of themselves. They didn't provide order. They didn't provide anything good for his people. So for Machiavelli, there is this sense in which it's permissible, and in fact, not just permissible, but expected to use force and fraud. But the use of force and fraud always have to be undergirded, as it were. They always have to be grounded in a commitment to providing good government to the people over whom you exercise authority. Um, he has one final. This is an interesting example, by the way, of what we might think of as like Machiavellian reasoning. This is the last paragraph in chapter 8. One might well wonder how, after so many betrayals and cruelties, Agathocles and others like him could live for such a long time secure in their native cities and defend themselves from foreign enemies without being plotted against by their own citizens. Many others, employing cruel means, were unable to hold on to their state, even in peaceful times, not to speak of the uncertain times of war. I believe that this depends on whether cruelty be badly or well used. Those cruelties are well used if it is permitted to speak well of evil. They are carried out in a single stroke, done out of necessity to protect oneself, and then are not continued, but are instead converted into the greatest possible benefits for the subject. Those cruelties are badly used that, although few at the outset, increase with the passing of time instead of disappearing. Those who follow the first method can remedy their standing, but with both with God and with men, as Agathocles did, and others cannot possibly maintain their positions. Hence, it should be noted that in conquering a state, its conqueror should weigh all the injurious things he must do and commit them all at once, so as to not have to repeat them every day. So throughout the Prince, you get these sort of weird and perverse examples of Machiavellian advice. So this is an example. If you're going to have to engage in cruelty, if you're going to have to engage in inflicting a certain amount of pain, his advice is to do it up front. It's always easier, it's always better in the long run to start mean and to get nicer than it is to start nice and to get meaner. Getting meaner over time, repeating the same injuries, it wears on people. And to be honest, this is actually something that I've learned to be the case in a classroom. It's very difficult to start extremely lenient and to get more strict as time goes on. It's better to inflict as much pain as possible at the beginning, and then people lower their expectations, and over time, if you get nice or if you make exceptions to the rules, you're seen as benevolent. Elsewhere, he notes that this is this weird kind of Machiavellian political. It's a kind of moral psychology. Like he's reading how other people behave, and he points out that if you kill if you kill someone's father, if you kill a man's father, he says he'll be extremely angry with you, but he'll eventually forget it. But if you take all of his property, he'll be extremely angry with you, and he'll never forget it because he's reminded on a daily basis that he's poor. He's reminded on a daily basis of all the things that he could have done or that he could do with the wealth that he'd previously acquired. So weirdly enough, he says people will hold theft against you much longer than they'll hold, the murder of your father. I'm not 100% sure that's true, but it's the example of the kind of Machiavellian psychology that he brings to bear in here. All right, we're going to jump up to chapter 15. So chapter 15 is a very momentous chapter. It's the middle chapter of the book, and it's a very well-known chapter for a variety of reasons. One of which is that he states about as clearly as you're going to see, he states as clearly as he can the sort of fundamental principles of Machiavellian realism. So chapter 15 is titled "Of Those Things for Which Men, and particularly Princes, Are Praised or Blamed." All right, so we're going to read these first couple paragraphs here. Now, it remains to be considered what should be the methods and principles of a prince in dealing with the subjects and allies, because I know that many have written about this. I'm afraid that by writing about it again, I shall be considered presumptuous, especially since in discussing this material, I depart from the procedures of others. And so when he says I depart from the procedures of others, is kind of an understatement. This is a sort of a radical break with the political philosophy that we find in the ancient um, pagans, so guys like Plato, Aristotle, Cicero. It's especially a break from the sort of political theory that we see coming out of Christian writers, figures like Augustine, even someone like Dante. So Dante's work on monarchy would have been very current at the time that Machiavelli's writing here. Since my intention is to write something useful for anyone who understands it, it seemed more suitable for me to search after the effectual truth of the matter rather than its imagined one. So this is a great phrase here, this idea of effectual truth. What Machiavelli means by effectual truth is something kind of like what we mean today by sort of scientific truth. The effectual truth is the truth that relates to causes and effect. It relates to causality. So what he wants to know with respect to politics is not an imagined one. So an imagined truth about politics would be something like the just city is divided into three parts. And we know it's just if those three parts keep to their respective duties. A wise city is one in which the wisest citizens lead it, et cetera, et cetera. Those are imagined truths, the kind of truths that we find in Plato's Republic and in Aristotle's Politics and elsewhere. Machiavelli is looking for what he calls the effectual truth. So, in other words, he's looking for the truth of what works. Right? He's looking for pragmatic truth. So the kind of thing, so the way that people talk about politics today with poll numbers and citing the American Political Science Review and looking at voter behavior after certain kinds of shocks. What's the effect of inflation on voter turnout? These are effectual truths. These are truths about cause and effect in the social and political world. Here's some key passages. Many writers have imagined republics and principalities that have never been seen nor known to exist in reality. For there is such a distance between how one lives and how one ought to live that anyone who abandons what is done for what ought to be done achieves his downfall rather than his preservation. So this is a direct reference to Plato here. Many writers have imagined republics and principalities that have never been seen nor known to exist in reality. That's Plato's Republic straightforwardly. Right. So rather than sit together and reason together about the nature of justice and how we might organize a city along the lines of this imagined form of justice, we're going to put those sort of pie in the sky discussions to the side. There's such a distance between how one lives and how one ought to live. Right. So there's such a huge difference between how we actually behave and how we think we ought to behave. People know how they ought to behave. They hear it every week at church. But there's such a distance between what they even acknowledge themselves, the way they ought to behave and how they actually behave, that anyone who goes about politics pretending that people behave well, pretending that people behave like they say they're going to behave at church, all they're doing is just setting themselves up for failure. A man who wishes to profess goodness at all times will come to ruin among so many who are not good. If you want to be a good person, if you want to live a moral life, right? If you want to live your life according to the dictates of reason, if you want to live your life according to scripture, if you want to live your life according to the teachings of the Catholic Church, whatever it may be, if you want to be a good person, Machiavelli says, then go to church. If you want to be in the in this game, right? If you want to play politics, if you want to be in the game of rising and falling of rulers and the kind of the inside baseball, these principalities and these sorts of things. If you want to play the game of politics, then you got to be ready to do something that isn't good. It is necessary for a prince who wishes to maintain himself to learn how not to be good and to use this knowledge or not to use it according to necessity. It's a great phrase here. It's necessary for a prince who wishes to maintain himself to learn how not to be good. You have to learn how to be cruel. You have to learn how to use badness. Right. So this paragraph is absolutely crucial. In some ways, it's kind of the centerpiece of the entire book. Princes how to learn how to be bad well, which means they have to learn how to do bad things in a way that's consistent with good rule. Uh, and so the chapters that come after this, after chapter 15, up until the last few chapters, they kind of deal with this sort of contrast between goodness and badness. So I'll give you an example of what I mean. So chapter 16 of generosity and miserliness. Um, Basically, the point of this, and he always sums them up in the last paragraph. Uh, the point is that generally people um, expect princes to be generous, and generally it's better for princes to be generous. And so essentially, what he says you ought to do is to always maintain, as far as you can, the appearance of generosity, but at the same time, you need to maintain your bottom line. A better example is here in 17 of cruelty and mercy, and whether it's better to be loved than to be feared, or the contrary. Turning to the other qualities mentioned above, let me say that every prince must desire to be considered merciful and not cruel. Right? So, in other words, you want to be considered merciful. You don't want to be considered cruel. Nevertheless, he must take care not to use such mercy badly. Cesare Borgia was considered cruel. Nonetheless, this cruelty of his brought order to the Romagna, united it and restored it to peace and loyalty. And so Borgia was cruel. He did not have a reputation for mercy, but his cruelty was well used. Um, Next paragraph. From this arises an argument whether it is be better to be loved than to be feared, or the contrary. The answer is that one would like to be both one and the other. But since it is difficult to be both together, it is much safer to be feared than to be loved when one of the two must be lacking. So, in other words, you want to contain both the capacity for mercy, which inspires love in others, and you also need to know how to use cruelty, which inspires fear in others. But if you're going to inspire fear in others, right? And he gives reasons why you would rather be feared than loved. So he says, you can generally say this about men. They are ungrateful, fickle, simulators and deceivers, avoiders of danger, and greedy for gain. While you work for their benefit, they are completely yours, offering you their blood, their property, their lives, and their sons, as I said above, when the need to do so is far away. But when it draws nearer to you, they turn away. The prince who relies entirely upon their words comes to ruin, finding himself stripped of the other preparations. So, I mean, think back to what we just talked about. Politics is a game where you deal with bad people. And Machiavelli says, in general, people are bad, right? The average person is ungrateful, fickle, he simulates, he deceives, he avoids danger, he's greedy for gain. People in general are bad. People in general are bad. And if you're dealing with bad people, it's better to deal with them according to a language that they speak and respect, which is the language of fear, than it is to speak to them in a language that they're more than willing to betray, which is the language of love. Friendships acquired by a price and not by greatness and nobility of spirit are purchased but are not owned, and at the proper time cannot be spent. Men are less hesitant about injuring someone who makes himself loved than one who makes himself feared, because love is held together by a chain of obligation that since men are a wretched lot is broken on every occasion for their own self-interest, but fear is sustained by a dread of punishment that will never abandon you. Right? People who get along with you because they love you, in the end, they can betray you. But someone who fears you isn't willing to betray you. Why? Because they fear punishment. So ultimately, he says if you have to choose between being loved and being feared, you should ultimately choose to be feared, even if you would like to do both. Go with being feared over being loved. Now, this is also a good example of the effectual truth. He's not saying, is it better to be feared or loved in the eyes of God? He's not saying, does it make you a moral person if you are feared rather than if you are loved? He's saying, listen, in politics, if you need to organize people, if you need to keep stability in a given realm, is it better to be loved or feared? Well, if you can be both, right, you can inspire order, you can inspire obedience with both love and fear, but ultimately fear is more valuable. If you have to choose, go with fear. Now, he says, too, in this next sentence, the prince must nevertheless make himself feared in such a way that he will avoid hatred. Right. So this is ultimately the way that Borgia got around the kind of fear that inspires hatred by having Dorco do all the bad things for him. Um, and then he usually comes back and sums this up at the end. So this is kind of a moral lesson that he's teaching here. Let me conclude then, returning to the issue of being feared and loved, that since men love at their own pleasure and fear at the pleasure of the prince, the wise prince should build his foundation upon that which is his own, not upon that which belongs to others. Only he must seek to avoid being hated, as I've said. In fear, he says, the relationships that you inspire through fear are more your own than the relationships of love. So this is a good example of Machiavelli's, what are sometimes called Machiavelli's teachings. um, Ultimately, he says, right, politics is not about being a good person. If you want to be a good person, go to church. If you want to play the game politics, you've got to learn these effectual truths. And the effectual truth is what works. So when it comes to whether you ought to be loved or be feared, just know that ultimately it's being feared that will work more effectually. It's being feared that will allow you to play this game of politics more effectually and more efficiently. All right, we will leave off there for today. Keep attending to your question sets, and we will finish our discussion of Machiavelli tomorrow. All right, bye, guys.